All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about corporate governance and how that relates to finance and different types of organizations and so forth. So there are a few broad types of business organizations. So we have sole proprietorships, various types of partnerships, various types of corporations. And ultimately, finance is going to play a role in all three of those broad types. It just might look a little bit different. So in the case of sole proprietorship, the person who's the finance officer is very possibly also the person who is sweeping the floor and locking up at the end of the day. In the case of a partnership, sometimes what happens with a partnership is we have certain partners that start focusing more on, say, finance functions, other partners that might be focusing more on, say, marketing functions. Sometimes we start getting a little bit more specialization that starts to appear there. Now, once you get to corporations, generally speaking, it's more common to have different people focusing on different tasks and in areas, basically. So that starts to be a little bit more specifically set up into different sections. Now, it's important to note that even if you are perhaps more focused by nature or perhaps your area of study on something like, say, marketing, if you focus on exclusively marketing and you start thinking, well, I'm a marketing person, I don't care about finance. Why do I need to care about that? The problem with that is that means you start missing the bigger picture of what's going on in the business. And so this is where you get into something that's called like silo thinking. So if you've ever been inside of a silo, think from like a farm, or if you've ever seen a picture of a silo, it's a big tube, right? Pretty much, where they store grain and things like that. And if you actually get inside of a silo and look around, basically all you can see is the inside of the silo. It blocks out your view of everything, right? Other than whatever's in the silo. So the idea behind silo thinking is kind of the idea that if you are so focused on your own little silo, then you don't see the bigger picture, you don't see anything else. And so if you get too focused on a specific little area, so even if you're working in a corporation and you're working in marketing or whatever else, or accounting or finance, and you're just seeing your one little piece, then you're not seeing the big picture. And if you're not seeing the big picture, that's going to limit your ability to advance in the firm and so forth. Because by the time you start looking at, say, the executive level, so think CEOs, CFOs, COO, those kinds of things, even if you're still sort of specialized in some area like the CFO versus COO, you have to be able to see the big picture. And because all the different areas relate. And so they're all interconnected. And so you can't afford to just sort of cut off certain areas and not be concerned about them. So just my admonition to you would be make sure you're not losing sight of the big picture, even if you are focused on some specific area of business that happens to not be finance. Now, since I can't resist noting, finance is a great area, though. So, like, you should focus on finance because finance is great. But anyway, I digress. Okay, so finance does play a role in all these kinds of organizations. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. Now, also, typically you're going to have a board of directors, particularly more for probably corporations and things like that. But you're going to have a board of directors. And on a board of directors, you're going to have people who are representing the interests of shareholders. And essentially, the people on the board of directors are generally elected, in effect, by shareholders. And that brings up the difference between individual and institutional investors. So if I'm looking at an individual investor, say, like me, Jonathan Wiley, and if I was an individual investor, I have a few shares, then I am going to be, sort of voting my interests on my shares. And if I actually manage to get onto a board, then I would be, kind of representing my interests and also hopefully the interests of other shareholders as well. Institutional investors, things get a little bit interesting. So if I think of, say, a mutual fund may own many, 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 many shares of a company. And then they perhaps might be expressing their opinions to companies. And that can take some different expressions. So in some cases, some mutual funds are more passive, and they basically say, just let the management do what they want to do. And in some cases, they may be a little bit more active with making recommendations and so forth. But they tend to be sort of representing the interests of a lot more shares because they're from an institution with holding a lot more shares. But also as a result of their situation, they are sort of in and of themselves acting as agents for the shareholders in their institution or the people who own the mutual fund and so forth. And so from that standpoint, or shares in the mutual fund. it can get a little bit interesting for what the motives are for the people on the board of directors and who they're representing and how they got on there and so forth. Now, that brings us to the topic of threats of takeover and activist investors. So if you have enough shares, then you can typically get enough votes. And if you can get enough votes, then you can generally have a large say in who's on the board of directors. And then the board of directors pretty much can determine who the executive team is. And then you pretty much decide what the company's doing. So if you want to take over a firm, basically what it turns into is you need enough shares to get enough votes to control the board of directors to then take over the firm. Now, there are some investors that are considered to be activist investors, and they specifically acquire shares to gain votes and sort of a say at the table and the board of directors to try to push a company to go in a particular direction that they think will be beneficial for them specifically and generally for shareholders broadly. But let's be honest, for them specifically. And so sometimes there'll be activist investors that will try to gain enough shares that they'll then threaten to try to do a takeover and try to push the company to do exactly what they want them to do, which gets kind of interesting. Now, below the board of directors, you have the CEO, chief executive officer, and then generally below that, we're going to have a chief operating officer, in many cases, chief financial officer, which, as a side note, I can't resist pointing out it's a chief financial officer, not a chief accounting officer. I'm just saying. But anyway, I digress. Accounting is great. Don't get me wrong. And ultimately, even though you can have those kind of roles typically at a corporation sort of organization structure, finance is playing a role in every organization. So whether it's from a small startup business that you're creating and you're running everything, up to a huge corporation that is one of the largest companies in the S&P 500, finance is playing a role in all of them because it's all about making good choices relative to risk and return and valuation and things like that. So finance is going to play a role in all of those kinds of scenarios. It just might look a little bit different and be a little bit more formal in some contexts than others. Okay, hopefully this video has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.